More and more people are becoming partnered later in life, and there might be some unequal assets by the time that people get together. You might be on your second relationship, or somebody might have started to build their wealth before you become a couple. And I think it's really important to have some tough conversations early on in the relationship to make sure that everyone has a plan. So my goal for today is for everyone to feel a little bit more informed and encouraged to have those tough conversations at the start of a relationship, and also to have some practical tips from a legal perspective of things that you can do to help protect yourself when you're going into a relationship. So if you know somebody that may be interested in this topic, please feel free to share this episode. My name's Rachelle Kroon. This is Property. Let's dive in. Kate O'Grady is an accredited family law specialist. She's also a mediator and a partner in Orbell Family Lawyers. She's also the person that I call if I'm doing something crazy like moving in with someone after I've fallen in love. So thank you so much to one of the busiest women I know for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to see you as always.
Now, before we dive into, I guess, what is a deep topic, tell me a little bit about you and about what you do every day.
Well, as you said, it's been a very busy, probably the last 2 years have been, some of the busiest of my life. As you said, I'm a family lawyer, work primarily on the Central Coast, but we cover pretty much Sydney to Newcastle, although I do have clients from all over the place. So I've got clients in Melbourne, some in Queensland. I've had one in Western Australia recently, so pretty much all over the country. So that keeps me quite busy. The practice is quite busy. We've grown really quickly over the last 2.5 years from 3 staff to I think we're at 21, possibly 22. So the growth has just been extraordinary. Incredible team, but very, very busy period of time. I'm also a mum, so I've got a very wild, wonderful 7 going on 20-year-old who keeps me on my toes. So there's some days I feel like I've already done a full day's work before I even step foot in the office. So that keeps me pretty busy between those things. As you said, I'm also a mediator and a family dispute resolution practitioner, which is just a fancy way of saying that's the parenting side of mediation. You have to do different training. And I'm trying to shift more into that area. I really enjoy doing that kind of work, which is, very different from the family law litigation practice, which I'm doing a lot of at the moment, but trying to move towards the mediation space.
So tell me, why did you go into family law to start?
It was a complete accident. There was zero intention whatsoever. Even to the point when I was doing my HSC, I think my selections for what I would study at uni were there was law, communications, there was zoology, science, social studies, arts, political science. There was drama teaching. There was everything. So I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I kind of fell into it by accident. I ended up studying journalism and law, and then I volunteered at a community legal centre in Katoomba, which is where I was living at the time, which was actually in 2005. So I started my family law career 20 years ago.
Wow.
As much as I hate to admit how long ago that was, but my mentor at the community legal centre, beautiful Sarah, was a family lawyer, and this incredible woman she was from the UK, and she'd been really involved in the feminist movement in the UK and, equal rights for women, and really passionate about, family violence and protecting women and children. And so I was lucky enough to have her as my mentor at the community legal centre. And because family law was her background, that was just pretty much her focus. So I started with her there. So
a strong woman got you into this.
Amazing. And she then, became part of my family. So she was a huge inspiration. And so from there, I then moved into private practice and have been practicing exclusively in family law ever since then.
Yeah, great. So Oh, you obviously know a lot about this topic. And as I said before, there is a lot of, I guess, misinformation or lack of knowledge around this topic. And it's scary. And people think, oh, that's a scary thing, talking to a lawyer, it might be really expensive. What would your top tip be for a couple when I guess they are considering moving in together?
Yeah. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and I think more so now than ever before, is having open, clear communication early. And the more work that you can do in the early stages, the less work you'll have to do later on. And I think it's a problem that we have as a society generally. It's not just related to family law, but there's a real resistance to have hard conversations. No one likes it. No one likes conflict. And the number of times that I say to clients, well, we could do this, and it involves having to have this conversation, and they say, absolutely not. I don't want to talk about that. We're not going to go there. And I think then what happens is you go into a relationship with expectations or assumptions about how you'll be in a certain situation or how the other person will be, not really understanding what their values might be around money or what their reaction might be to certain circumstances. Do you even know whether you can live together or how you can live together if they're going to drive you crazy by something that they do? And I think just really simple things like having some discussions about those things and working out, do you even know what your own values are? Do you know what your habits around money are? Do you know what expectations or assumptions you might have around that? For example, just really basic things like, have you thought about how bills will be paid and how that will work? Will they be shared equally? What happens if someone loses their job or if they are unwell and they can't work? Do you still have that same expectation around what their role might look like? Do you plan to have children? Do you plan to get married? And sometimes you don't want to think about those things early on. But the reality is that the problems that I see at the tail end of the relationship is largely because people haven't had any of those conversations in the early days. And I think the more you can actually think about, well, what is it that is really important to me in terms of money or in terms of roles and values around money, and am I compatible with this person? And what happens when there's conflict? Can we work it out? Can we talk about it? Are we on the same page?
Yeah.
And if you can keep those conversations going, then generally they're the people that will be okay.
So have the conversation early and cover everything up front.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, just by nature of the financial agreement process, it involves a huge amount of discussion and disclosure about your circumstances and questions from annoying lawyers like me saying, have you thought about getting married? Have you thought about having children? Have you thought about what happens if someone gets sick, or what if they win lotto? So you might say, well, I really want to protect my house. Would you still feel like that if your partner won $10 million in lotto? Would you still be okay to keep your assets separate? And so that's part of, I guess, my role in the early stages, and it's something I would encourage people to do early, is to get advice. And it's something that most people probably would never think of, to get advice from a family lawyer going into a relationship, because it's generally something you would associate with separation. And people usually wouldn't think a family lawyer might be able to help save a relationship. But in some ways we can say, well, if you have this conversation and do this and this and this and this, it can actually help you to stay together and to, be aware of the things that could go wrong and fix them before they go wrong.
See, I think a lot of people would hear the term family lawyer and think, well, we don't even have a family yet, so why would I be talking to a family lawyer before moving in with someone? But you're saying that is the person you would still call before you move in?
Yes. So, and I the best time to get advice from a family lawyer is in the context of parties that are wanting to protect their assets before you move in, or at least before you've lived together for 2 years. And in the context of people that are potentially separating or having some rockiness in their relationship, before you separate and before you have discussions around the separation, because it's really important that you enter those discussions from a position of knowing what your rights are, knowing what you're entitled to, knowing what risks, but also knowing what the process looks like and what to expect, because people have really different and often unrealistic expectations about what the family law process looks like and what it involves.
Yeah, and we had a discussion which actually sparked this episode, which is I say generally to get a binding financial agreement, which is also known as a BFA, for people when they are, especially if there is unequal assets at the start. And that's the term I always use when people are, I guess, looking for protection. But you said to me that a binding financial agreement is great, but not for everyone. So I guess the important question to ask is who does suit a binding financial agreement, and what would somebody use other than that?
Yeah, so just for people listening, a financial agreement is essentially a contract that two people enter into outside of court, and it can be entered into during a relationship, or at the very start.
Before you move in?
Like a prenup, but it also applies to people that don't want to get married. That basically says this is how we're going to divide our property in the event that we separate in the future. You can also do them at the end after you separate. You can say we've separated and this is how we want to divide the property. So they can be a really excellent way to avoid court and to have control over the process and say, well, no, we've reached a decision. This is how we want it to happen. The problem is that we cannot guarantee with absolute certainty that it will in fact be binding and not set aside by a court in the future. And so there have been over the past couple of years a number of cases where you've seen financial agreements set aside. And so what we then look at is what are the circumstances in which they're set aside? And more often than not, it's in circumstances where they were entered into where it was unfair. The agreement was unfair, or somebody was under pressure or duress. And the cases where you typically see that more often than not is where they're entered into in a very early stage of a relationship where there's an inequality in the bargaining position of the parties, or someone's got all of the money and all of the assets, and then they might go on to have children. And having kids is such an unknown. You don't know who the primary care is going to be. You don't know whether the children will have any health issues. You don't know how the roles that each of you agreed that you would do might change or how that might impact the relationship. So it's very hard to have a financial agreement that covers all of the contingencies, let alone then having children. So typically for young couples that might want to get married, that might want to have children, they might not be the best way to protect you because they could end up being unfair if they don't properly provide for what happens in the event of children. And it's quite rare, but all you have to do is say, what happens if one of the children have really high medical needs that aren't properly covered by that agreement? It will not be worth the paper it's written on, and the court will set it aside because it will cause financial hardship to the child or children of that relationship. So we as practitioners need to be very careful that we're not saying to people, yes, I can protect you. This document is bulletproof. You can trust me. Give me your money. When in fact the chances of that, being set aside are quite high in those types of circumstances.
So in those cases, might it be appropriate to get a binding financial agreement? Let's say a young couple are getting together, but there's an unequal amount of assets at the start. A binding financial agreement now, but then it would have to be reviewed in 5 years' time if their life changed and they entered a family arrangement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is absolutely, I think what most lawyers would say would be the ideal way to approach it. And so some of the options that we have is that you can have a financial agreement at the start of a relationship, which basically gives you that peace of mind to cover the first period of time and to see how you go living together and whether it's going to work to protect those assets at the start. You can have a termination clause which basically terminates the financial agreement if there's children born. Okay. And then you renegotiate and potentially look at having another one or not having one and then leaving it open to discussion. But ideally, the best financial agreements are reviewed every 5 years to make sure that they properly cover the parties and still meet the needs of the person in terms of protection, and that you're looking at what might have changed and does it properly cover that. Because the reality is that the law changes all the time and it might be completely out of our control. The legislation might change and it might retrospectively impact an agreement in a way that we didn't foresee at the time. So it's a good idea to just keep looking at them and make sure that they still cover you.
And I know for me, it was, a second relationship, and we weren't planning to have children. So it was just black and white that a binding financial agreement is the best way forward. But if you were a young couple and maybe you thought you're going to plan to have children, and maybe you thought a binding financial agreement isn't for you, or you just thought that's a really expensive thing for us to do, are there some practical things that people can do at the start of a relationship, I guess, that they can do without a lawyer, maybe even, to help themselves protect their assets or outline things before they move in and I guess, join their finances?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it would be kind of what we do is the financial agreement process anyway, but which is to look at and identify what is your income at this point in time, what assets do you have and what are they valued at? Because a lot of the time when you get to the separation stage and you're doing your settlement, it's relevant what people had at the start and what their initial contributions were, but no one has any evidence of it.
Yeah.
Because it could have been a long time ago. You might not be able to get that under subpoena anymore because no one keeps records past 7 years. And so if people going into a relationship can have records of, well, my house had a market value of X at this date, and I'm just going to pop this in a folder or on my computer somewhere. My bank account had X amount of dollars in it by way of savings. I had this share portfolio at this time. My car was worth X. My credit card had a balance of this at this time. If you have that, you are 95% ahead of most people when they get to the separation stage of being able to at least prove what your initial contributions were at the start. So if both people do that, it can be really useful then. I mean, it's not the end of it. It doesn't all turn on that point, but it's incredibly helpful to have those records available, and then coupled with a discussion around what's your view about this and how do you respond to this, and what's your values around money? And, I was joking with my partner in the car on the way up, if your partner had to go through your bank statements and see what you're spending money on, what are the things that you'd kind of be a little bit embarrassed about them seeing on your bank statements, and maybe having some conversations around, spending and how that might impact the relationship.
And I talk to some people that think that when they join finances, that's the part that actually binds them. But you said something earlier about that 2-year mark of living together. So tell me, why is that 2-year mark so important?
So, and I mean, I should say, and law's very annoying in this way. That's why lawyers always say may and possibly, and because it's never entirely black and white.
Yeah.
There's always exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, a de facto relationship will be regarded as one where the parties have lived together for at least 2 years.
Okay.
So,
was that less time before?
No, and a lot of people think that it's 6 months, or that as soon as you start living together, and people think, oh, they're entitled to 50% because we've been living together for 6 months. Even if you live together for 2 years, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily any entitlement to any of your assets, because there needs to be a contribution to the assets in order for there to be an adjustment. So the way that it works is you look at what are the assets available. So you look at the assets, your liabilities, your super, financial resources, and then you work out what contributions have each party made to those, and is there any adjustment required because one or both parties has future needs, considerations that may need to be taken into account. For example, is there a child of the relationship? Are there health issues that might need to be covered by some additional support? But typically in short relationships, it comes down to what people put in. It's really focused on the financial contributions for short. And by short relationships, I mean under 5 years, classed as short. And there's a much stronger focus on your financial contributions in a shorter relationship than there would be in a long one. So if you're together for 20 years, what you have at the start is going to be much less relevant than what you had if you've been together for 3 years. That will pretty much determine the outcome if you come in with a huge amount of money.
And I think that's a fear for some people when you are, especially if somebody has built a property portfolio and maybe they're moving in with a partner that they're very much in love with but has a very different asset position. Maybe they don't get to the point of, getting married and having children, but how do I protect myself in this short little gap at the beginning before that happens? So you would say things like, sit down, have a conversation, document the conversation, and have proof of all of what, I guess, your assets are at the start.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing really binding other than a financial agreement. So even if things are documented, it's not necessarily going to be, if you, for example, if you say, we agree that this is what's going to happen in the relationship, it won't bind anybody in any particular way. But it's just good so that you're both clear and on the same page and you understand.
And you've had the difficult conversation when everybody is getting along at the start, because it's a lot harder to have that conversation on the other end.
Yes. And if the relationship is broken down, faults become magnified. If someone's had smoked a joint in the relationship, it's often they're a drug addict, or if they've, watched a little bit of porn, they're, a porn addict, and it's, they have a glass of wine and they're an alcoholic, and you tend to look through a negative lens, I think, if the relationship has already broken down and there's mistrust or there's anger or hurt. And so if you have those discussions early on, I think it helps to stop a lot of it later on and what the big problems can be later on.
So I think a lot of people would be scared to call a lawyer. I think it's something, especially going into a relationship, let's say nothing's gone wrong. I think most people would call a lawyer at the first time if they've left their partner or thinking of leaving their partner. How would we encourage people to talk to a lawyer before they actually move in with someone? Like, is it a scary thing to do?
I mean, look at me. I'm not. I mean, I can be scary, but no. I think it's really important, and we're just humans, and that have a particular area of knowledge. And it would be like someone coming to you before they go to buy a house, to work out what can I borrow and what might I need to do to have that borrowing capacity. Do I need to get my spending in order? Do I need to improve my credit rating? It's kind of the same thing. It's like a health check for your, relationship, and sometimes can actually prevent a separation, because you say, well, if you do X, Y, Z, have these conversations, put these things in place, there might not be a fight about it later on. So if you can prove your house was worth X, there might not be a dispute about it, and you might not have to pay thousands of dollars to get a valuation later on down the track. So I think definitely educating people around, we're not just for the end. Our role is literally to tell people, this is how family law works. These are what your rights are. This is how the separation process works. This is how financial agreements during relationships work. And what to expect through the process. And I think a lot of my job is spent trying to convince people not to go to court.
Yes.
And not to fight, and to avoid going down that and try to look at ways to resolve it. But it can be really hard once that relationship has already broken down. But also if people have already made decisions that might not necessarily be in their best interest. So, for example, I will often talk to people about going to see a broker early and getting advice about, their borrowing capacity and getting their finances in order, and seeing an accountant and getting tax advice and seeing a counsellor and addressing it holistically, rather than if people have come to you and they've already taken money out of a joint account and they've, already sold things and they've already, put things in place that can't be undone. It can be very hard then for us to try to fix it once it's already gone a bit pear-shaped. So it's like damage control early on. In
the process. So we might take a break there and come back and talk about, I guess, the things to do when you're separating.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
This is Property is brought to you by Sphere Home Loans. Sphere Home Loans is a mortgage broker that helps our listeners all around Australia. So, if you want to get into your first home sooner, looking at upgrading, an additional property, or want your current mortgage reviewed, just search Sphere Home Loans or click the link in the show notes, and their dedicated brokers will be able to help you wherever you are. If you are, however, after personal financial advice, don't get it from a podcast. If you would like help based on your own personal situation, head over to moneypodcast.com.au, click Get Help, and we'd be happy to introduce you to one of our trusted professionals. That's moneypodcast.com.au and click Get Help.
We are back with Kate O'Grady, and we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about, I guess, what happens on the way out of a relationship. So, Kate, when people are separating, I'm going to ask you the question, how do people separate well?
Okay, so you can do it, I guess, is the thing. I think most people associate separation with fighting and conflict and drama and
Court.
court, lawyers. And just because you have lawyers involved doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to end up in court or end up in a fight. Sometimes having really good lawyers involved early on can stop that from happening. So it can be helpful to get good lawyers involved on both sides early on, just so people are getting reasonable advice and they're not being told they're entitled to something that they're not, because that can cause a lot of problems. So I think key tips for separating well is to be honest with yourself about what you've done in the relationship. For example, if you came in with $100,000, don't insist it was $400,000, if you can't prove it. And don't say that the other person did nothing if they did things. I think it just makes it so much harder. And I think understand that it is a process that people find difficult. People are hurt, they're angry, people come at it at different stages. But the quicker you can get out of it and move past it, the better it will be, especially if you've got kids. So the key thing, I think, is to try to work out an exit strategy as soon as possible. And the best way to do that is to be upfront about your financial circumstances and don't try to hide things, because we find them. And it just risks that if you do enter into an agreement and you haven't disclosed something of significance, it will be set aside. So it won't actually protect you. So if you're not honest, you're only risking your financial security in the future by potentially having something set aside. So be upfront about your financial circumstances, give disclosure to the other person. Both parties have to disclose.
So disclosures when you have to talk about everything that you have.
So disclosure is basically a fancy way of talking about information and documents that are relevant to an issue in the matter. So it applies to parenting, which could be, psychological reports or school reports or medical reports for a parent or a child. In a property or financial matter, in that context, it's generally you're looking at documents that prove your income, so tax returns, pay slips, employment contracts. Then you're looking at bank statements to show, your money that you've got in the bank, but also potentially money that you may have had and no longer have in the bank. Value of shares, value of property, value of cars.
Yeah.
If you have an interest in a trust, value of super, what debts you have. Ideally, we want to come up with a balance sheet that has a list of what the assets and liabilities and the superannuation is and agree on the values. If people can't agree on the values, we'll generally get a valuer in to get a valuation done, and then try to exchange, some offers back and forth. If you can't agree, go to mediation. Most matters would settle somewhere in that process. It's still, I think, about 3 to 5% of matters that actually end up going to court.
That's a very small percentage.
Yes, yeah. And I think, you tend to sometimes get a bit of a skewed view if you're dealing with litigation matters, because you tend to feel like that's how everybody separates, but that's not the reality. Most people settle very early with the assistance of a whole range of people.
Yeah. And do you think people would separate better if they had the conversation at the start?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think not just at the start, but ongoing. If you have clear communication and get help with it. Not everyone finds that easy. It's really hard and it's something you have to work on. But if you do it, it's like going to the gym. If you're looking after your physical health, but if you look after your relationship health and have those conversations throughout, you don't see the same issues. And it's funny, most people that actually go through the BFA or the financial agreement process never need them. And it's really interesting if you think about the psychology, because they've had all of the discussions. They've talked about all of the what-ifs that could happen in the relationship, and they've both talked about it, and they've both had advice about it, and they've both had it documented. This is what we agree. This is what's going to happen during, and this is what will happen when we separate. Most of those people never need it.
Yeah, okay, that's really important. So the binding financial agreement, let's go back to it. Who do you think should get a binding financial agreement?
Yes.
Who do they work for?
Yeah. So my favourite ones to do are people that are potentially in their second relationship, maybe been through it before, a little bit older, know that they're not going to have children, and are prepared to have those conversations and share the information. They're fine. They're still complex, and you still have to have regard to all of the contingencies and changes in circumstances that could happen. But they're a lot easier than younger couples that haven't thought about any of those things and where there's a risk that there might be children or significant changes to their circumstances. So definitely second or third relationships, especially where people have already been through the process and they know how awful it can be when it's not done well, they tend to be much more open to doing it properly and participating in the discussion and going through the disclosure because they don't want to have that same experience that they potentially had the last time around.
Yeah.
So it can be quite a different experience to do that for. And I've had a lot of repeat clients where I've acted for them in their separation that they then come back and say, can you please do a financial agreement for me so I don't ever have to go through that again? And so they're where it can be a really, really useful tool for those people.
Yeah, and I think hearing you say that, where people have learnt that lesson and they're coming back to make sure they've got that binding financial agreement in their second relationship, my wish for people is that they can learn from somebody else's mistakes first or what they didn't have in place first and actually get that in place for them on their first relationship and not have to learn it the hard way.
Yeah. And look, I've been through my own separation and I think, there's a lot of things I learnt the hard way through that. Thinking, it'll be all right. We don't need to do that. And on reflection, there were lots of things that I could have done better or differently through that process. I think it's made me a better lawyer.
I bet it has.
I have a lot more empathy for people going through the process, and I understand what it feels like to go through that and what it feels like to receive a letter from a lawyer and to sit in a courtroom and not be the lawyer in the courtroom. I know what that feels like. So I think that's given me a much better understanding of what it's like to be on the other side of it, and how to better understand people in that context and the stress that they're under when trying to make decisions.
And you saying that is so refreshing, that even working in this industry, even knowing everything you do about family law, when you were in the situation, you still had your emotions going, it will be fine. And I was the same, but I need someone like you to say to me, that's great that you're completely in love and you don't have to worry about this, but let me tell you the things that you need to put in place now to protect yourself.
Yeah, and that's her nice way of saying that the conversation is, yes, but have you thought about every possible bad thing that can happen? And it's an awful conversation to have with people when they're madly in love and they're in a new relationship and they're really excited because the whole road's ahead of them. And I just want, my favourite thing is if people stay together. I'm a champion for the lovers, and for the peacemakers. Notwithstanding my job is, related to separation, but I like to try to help people sort their matters out and not go to court. I hate court. But part of that job, my job, is I have to have really uncomfortable conversations. And I imagine it would be like a wills and estate lawyer saying, what if you die? It's it's not a nice conversation to have, but it's like, well, what if somebody gets sick, or what if they lose their job, or what if one person gets an inheritance, or what if this person promises to pay half of the mortgage and they don't, or what if you find out that they've got a gambling problem, or your online shopping problem, which would be that would be the things in my bank statement that I'd be, I don't know, uncomfortable about. But it's just thinking about all of the things that could potentially, what if someone has an accident and becomes disabled? Does the agreement still stand about, how things will be divided if someone gets sick or can't work? And COVID was wild for us.
It was so wild.
You know what it was like. Try tell people what's going to happen, even with property prices, or what's going to happen with the share market, or we had no idea.
And everyone separated?
Everyone. I've never been busy. I've never been busier because you have this melting pot of people that are stuck together, and you throw, relationship pressure, financial pressure, a lot of people losing their businesses and jobs, people being unwell, kids being home, kids being home. That's a huge stressor, we see a spike in calls after each school holiday period when people have spent too much time at home, with kids, because it's hard, it's stressful. But then through COVID, if you throw in mental health issues, family violence issues, huge risk issues where people are stuck together.
Yeah.
It was incredibly busy, but really hard because we had a lot of uncertainty, particularly around property prices. I mean, I had a matter where there was a $2.5 million difference between a valuation that the clients paid for and then what the house sold for.
You see that a lot.
And if you've got a property settlement where you're factoring a lump sum payment rather than a percentage and you have that level of difference, it's just wild. So I now build into my financial agreements, health pandemics like COVID-19 or things like that, to say that even in the event that happens, this will not be, not be set aside. Not that would necessarily bind, a court might find that that's not, appropriate. But they're the types of things that we have to think about is what are all the things that could happen in the future and how could that impact this couple.
So I think some of the things that people find scary about talking to a family lawyer, it would be a cost thing. And I know that at the start of a relationship, if we're going to encourage people to have those discussions and maybe get a binding financial agreement if it's appropriate for them, I'm not going to nail you down to a price. Can we get like a rough idea of, I guess, the cost that would be involved to prepare binding financial agreements, just really ballpark?
Yeah. So it really depends whether they're at the start of a relationship or whether they're at the end.
Let's just talk just at the start. A young couple, they've got an unequal amount of property. They just want to protect one person in that, that period, while they're getting on, just a real ballpark figure.
Yeah. So look, I've seen a lot of people quote prices like $1,500 or $2,500, and I realistically don't think that they can or should be done for that because of what's involved in it. So generally you would be looking at least $5,000 for a pre-separation financial agreement, but often between 5 to 10.
Yeah.
People really freak out at that. But what I would say is, well, if you don't have that, and you can't agree on what your settlement could look like, you might be looking at $100,000 to $200,000 each in legal fees to go to court to have a judge make a decision. And so when you think about it in that context, it's really not that much of an
100%.
investment if you have that peace of mind that you won't have to pay those, legal fees at the end.
And that's why I wanted to talk about the cost. I guess as someone who's paid both costs either side, I think paying that money up front at the start of a relationship and just having it all outlined and documented, and the percentage of people that I see on the other side that are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to court, and even before court they can get to that kind of level. But that could be saved at the start if they did this sort of planning. So I just wanted people, I guess, to not have the fear of a number, and I guess feel free to think about the cost. And when you're thinking about under $10,000, when we talk about, income protection, and we talk about buyer's agents fees, and we talk about stamp duty and the other costs that people have actually already put in place to protect their wealth, I think this is probably the bigger one and one of the most important.
Yeah, and it is. I was just about to say it's very similar to an insurance policy. And so if you think about having your house insured and having that insurance policy in place, having to pay a small amount of excess versus having your house damaged in a storm and then having to pay for the repairs without having an insurance policy in place. It's very similar.
Yeah.
So provided that and I think it really does depend on whether they're done properly, because a lot of people do them that shouldn't do them. And there's a lot of services that promote themselves as being, we'll do it, it's very simple. Just come and we'll do it for both of you and we'll send you both to a lawyer.
For both of you?
Well, and that's problematic in and of itself. They have to get separate legal advice, both parties. But there's a lot of services now that try to say, come to us and we'll do the bulk of it and then send you both to separate lawyers. And a lot of work for family lawyers is challenging those types of agreements to set them aside, because if they're not done properly, then they will be subject to challenge, and then you could still have to pay the legal fees down the track. So if you are going to do it, it is important that you do it properly and you see a lawyer that knows what they're doing. And unfortunately, that does mean a higher cost, but it also means greater protection, I think.
Yeah, well, there's no point in paying for something that isn't going to protect you. It's like an insurance policy. You want to make sure it's actually going to do its job.
Yeah, you pay for one of those insurance policies that has every exclusion under the sun, so there's no point paying the money in the first place.
That's right.
It's the same.
So we've talked about having the conversations, the uncomfortable conversations up front. We've talked about documenting things at the start before you move in together to make sure you've got those sorts of records at the start. We've talked about the importance of a binding financial agreement and what they are. And we've talked about how maybe to separate well and, I guess some of the steps to go through when you are separating. Are there any other thoughts or insights that you would share with people that we haven't covered?
Yes. So I think I kind of touched on it earlier about it being quite a holistic process. And so I think get advice from other people as well. So if you do have assets that you're looking to protect, go and talk to a financial planner. Go and talk to an accountant, because I might say something in terms of asset protection that might not be the same or consistent with that advice. So they might give advice about, trust structures or, and even though a lot of people have misconceptions around that and that their, family law can't touch them, which we can.
But we talked about that on an episode a few weeks ago.
Yes. So, but I mean, if you're looking to protect your wealth and your assets, it's very important that you get advice from a financial planner and an accountant about how best to do that. Long term, and what kind of decisions could impact that to get tax advice on things. And then if you're looking at, changing that in any way during a relationship, there can be tax effective measures that you can put in place during a relationship that might be beneficial, but there could then be family law implications for those decisions.
Yeah.
So I guess the best way to approach a matter would be to do it holistically. And I like to work with a team, whether it's at the start or the end of a relationship. And so you'd be saying you need to go and talk to a broker to get advice and you need to tidy this up,
And get all your valuations done. Your broker can do that for you.
Exactly, and get an idea of those things. Talk to your accountant. We need to know if this triggers this, what tax consequences there are going to be and are there better options. And if someone's looking at a settlement that's A versus B, a financial planner is going to be in a really good position to say, well, if you do that, this is what you'll look like in 5 to 10 years versus if you do this, this could be like that. And so what you think might be the better option, and often that's around cash versus super.
Yeah.
And I can't give that advice about what's best for people and how to structure it or what investment should be made. So I would absolutely say for people in that situation, and especially if you're in a position where you have a lot of wealth to protect or you're expecting to make money, receive an inheritance, your business is about to go well, to get advice, from a family lawyer about how to protect it, an accountant about how to protect it, your financial planner about how to invest it, have a really good broker that you have a good relationship with that you can pick up the phone and say, can you tell me if I can do this and what do I need to do to be able to do this? And, I always recommend a counsellor or a psychologist or someone to help with the mental health side of things, because if you're looking at separation, but even for conflict management, during a relationship can be really helpful as well. So if you think about having a whole team there to help you, I think that is the best advice.
Now, that just made me think of something you did say earlier on about during if you're considering separating, if anyone was listening in and they were considering separating, would you consider talking to a family lawyer before they separate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's and I've convinced a lot of people to stay together in those conversations. Absolutely, because I think when people realise, when you're together, you're sharing the pie, and you can have access to the whole pie. Sometimes, there's always exceptions. But when you split, you got to split the pie. And so it can be quite confronting to people when they realise what that might look like. And, it often can involve having to sell the family home or having to sell things that people can be quite attached to, or, not quite realising the financial situation that they're actually in.
Yeah.
So perhaps not really thinking about, oh, hang on, I have these debts and these are going to have to be taken care of, or I'm going to have to disclose these things. And so it can be quite confronting. But there can also be things that people can do to protect themselves and set themselves up for a better separation. And so, for example, if you're in a relationship where you don't really know much about the other person's financial circumstances, it can be a good time to kind of think, okay, well, are there things that I can find out now while we're still together that I might not be able to find once we separate? And do I need to put, protections in place to joint bank accounts so that they can't be drained and things like that, just so that people can get advice about things. And if a property is only in one person's name, what does that mean? And people constantly say, can I change the locks? Can I move out? What impact will that have on the settlement if I do that? And what are my rights about, accessing the property or joint bank accounts? And, things might be in one person's name. So just being aware of what your rights are and how the law applies to those things can be really empowering, so that when you do have the discussion and, you have someone saying, oh, well, my neighbour told me that I'd get 75% because of blah. Yeah. You can actually know, well, I know that that's not true because I've had advice. So I know that my range is here. And then it also stops people offering more. I see a lot of people that come in and said, I've agreed to this outcome. And when I go through their history, I say, oh, my goodness, okay, we need to dial that back because you're actually entitled to a lot more than that. And obviously it's up to people as if they choose to accept something that's a little bit less than what they're entitled to. But sometimes it's a significant difference.
And it's a lot harder to go back once you've already said it.
Right. And then it creates an expectation in the other person's mind that they might then not move from, even though it's completely unrealistic. And so then you end up fighting about something that you shouldn't have been fighting about in the first place. So I think if both people get advice early on, it can be really helpful, provided that it's good advice and reasonable. Yeah. It can really help.
Well, we have covered a lot today about relationships, having the difficult conversations at the start. And I really hope that having those difficult conversations at the start might help you, I guess you feel encouraged to have those conversations now to maybe stop potential issues down the track. So that binding financial agreement, get it done, lock it up, put it somewhere and carry on with your beautiful relationship. But they're really important to have if they're right for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It can be a really effective tool for the right people.
The right people. Kate O'Grady from Allbell Law, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to put your details in the show notes if anyone wants to reach out. But you've been listening to This Is Property, and I'm Rachelle Kroon.
Any information given in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and you should seek your own property advice before acting on anything you may hear in this podcast. If you want to start or advance your property education journey, John Pidgeon's book, Sort Your Property Out and Build Your Future, is available where all good books are sold, or via the link in the podcast show notes. Opinions or comments from any guests on the podcast are theirs and not those of the hosts, the publisher, or their respective license holders.